Hey YouTube, how's it going? This is Chris Adams for SeniorWebDeveloper.life. Today I want to talk about the concept of story points. So for those of us that are working in a Agile or Scrum environment, story points are one way to measure your effort. And for the longest time, I didn't think story points were a good idea. Because what eventually happens is it gets boiled down into hours. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with this whole work concept, the way this all started was a bunch of programmers got together, a small bunch, and made the Agile manifesto for how they're going to write software. And the general idea was they would get together every day, discuss for a very short amount of time, 10 minutes or less, in a stand-up meeting, what they're going to do for the day, what they did yesterday, whether they have any blockers, and then they kind of clap their hands and say break and go back to work. What this has become is a gigantic industry of Scrum and Agile, and there are positions that get hired for. You can be hired on now as a Scrum Master, and that's your whole job at a company. And what it turns into is a gigantic mess for micromanaging developers. So this has happened to me at two companies, where you might start with a fairly kind of startup-y sort of team. There might be, 4 to 8 developers, and you just are whacking things into production, getting a company off the ground. There's no QA department, there's no checks and balances. Sometimes everybody's writing to the production server at the same time. It's can be very exciting in good and bad ways. So eventually people will come along, or the company will have enough money to blow it on becoming Agile or using Sprint. So then what typically happens now, because there's an industry, is okay, now we don't need 8 developers anymore. We need to have a product owner, project manager, Scrum Master. And so now you have, for each developer, you may have as many as 3 managerial people that appear. So you go from your 8-person development team to a 25-person team where it's still the same 8 developers. So a lot of these meetings are the developers just telling everybody else what's going on. So you have a stand-up meeting that you desperately try to get lower than 20 minutes, and it can wander and take half a day, but occasionally they can, everybody can learn how to do it faster. And then you have all the different parts of Scrum, where you have grooming and stories and user stories and planning poker and all kinds of extra woo-woo stuff about Scrum and Agile that's no longer about delivering code. So it's not all bad. It does force the business or your concept, instead of saying, oh, I have to connect to a new payment API. Last time it took our company 6 months, but I'm way smarter than that guy, so I can do it in 3 weeks. And then of course you start the project and it takes you 8 months, and it's pretty much a failure, but there's too much sunk money into it, so you kind of have to keep going. With the concept of Sprint and Agile, you take that job and you say, okay, the epic, the 1-sentence description is, okay, we need to connect to a different payment API. And then you say, okay, well, what does this take? And you try to get your tasks down into things that will take 4 to 8 hours per task. So you say, okay, well, I have to write a class, I have to figure out how to get a token to use the API. I have to figure out how to parse the stuff that comes back. I have to do this, I have to do that. So now you have connected a new payment API is your epic task, and then underneath it you have a lot of subtasks. You know, set up my Git branch, set up a test framework, you know, do the front end, and that's really good because it breaks down the work. You think about everything you're going to need, and sometimes all these extra management people can come in handy when you say, you know what, at some point I need to send an email to somebody. As a developer, I really don't care what it says. I can make it say whatever you want. Somebody else has to make that decision. You can break down your project, and then you say to yourself, wow, if I do all these, each one of them is going to take me 4 hours to do it. So if I add up all these tasks, now I have 40 or 50 tasks. This really is going to take me 6 months to do this instead of the 6 weeks that I thought I could do it in. So there's a lot of benefit to that. What I wanted to talk about today is the idea of story points. So story points are assigned to the difficulty of a task. Okay, and initially, well, for the longest time, I thought that this was kind of nonsense. So why would you have a story point? Why don't you just say hours? This will take me 3 hours, because a lot of times we're trying to figure out, well, how many hours of work is a story point? And because we're not really doing Agile as it was originally envisioned, but we're doing Agile as a very corporate micromanagement platform, we have to figure out at the end of the week, depending on the culture and temperament where you work, you may get chastised for not doing enough story points. So story points, at the end of the day, they become equivalent to hours. Okay? But there's a pretty big difference between story points and hours that it took me a long time to realize the benefit of this. So a story point is typically given in something that makes a developer sound smart. They can either do planning poker, which sounds very smart, and it's a fun game that you can actually, if you don't have very much to do, you can play planning poker for hours and get almost nothing done. But you had a fun game talking about how long work would take you if you actually did the work instead of playing planning poker and then look at your watch and say, oh, time for lunch. So yeah, I've been in one of those environments too. But anyway, another very fancy sounding way to estimate size is using Fibonacci numbers. I don't really remember whether the 0 or 1 starts a Fibonacci sequence. It has to have a kind of catalyst. But the numbers in a Fibonacci sequence are 1, 1, 2, then 3, then 5, then 8, then 13, then 21. And if you get beyond 21, it's probably going to be too big a guess. So this is a couple of things. The way that those numbers are generated is each new number is the sum of the two previous numbers. So 5 is the sum of 2 and 3, and 8 is the sum of 3 and 5, and 13 is the sum of 5 and 8, and so on. So the Fibonacci sequence has a lot of wonderful properties, and you can make, you know, the seashells and stuff like that, and ferns and all kinds of stuff have this sequence in there. But anyway, back to estimating work. What it allows you to do when you use them properly is you say, okay, this is going to be a medium effort task. I think this will take me five story points. So then if I say, well, this is going to be a harder task, a little bit harder than a medium task, but I really don't think it's a hard task, you still have to, even if you want to give it a 6 for difficulty rating, you have to give it an 8. And what this means is, as the tasks get larger, the steps between each task, the steps between each level of difficulty get bigger because there's more unknowns. And once you get to a larger unknown, like the Fibonacci sequence after 21 is going to be 34, right? So it's going to be significantly bigger than the difference from 13 and 21. And so then that becomes so big that you can't really do it. So once you have your Fibonacci numbers as an estimate, you can figure out in your sprint time, let's use 1 week for simplicity's sake, and you figured out historically you've been able to get 10 story points or 2 medium difficult tasks done in a week. So that way you could say, okay, this task we've assigned a difficulty rating of 5. It's a medium difficulty task. Historically, we've been able to do 2 of these a week. So then when you try the task, if it takes you an entire week, you're like, wow, I was way off. I was half off in my estimate. So then you can adjust that in the future and say, well, the next time I see a similar task, I know that that's not an 8, that's not a 5 difficulty, it's the next level difficulty, which actually becomes an 8, which is almost twice as much work. And that's where the benefit of using a story point instead of simply hours comes in. Because your story point estimates are going to change, and if you're writing code, you're always writing something, well, not always, but you're frequently writing something that doesn't exist, that's unknown. You're creating something brand new that didn't exist before. So lots of times, most programmers underestimate, and they underestimate horribly. And one thing a story point allows you to do is figure out how far you're underestimating. So for example, say you have a budget, again, of 10 story points in a week. And the developer pulls in all these story points and tries to do the work, and say completes 1 task, so a 5-point task. The wrong way to do this is the kind of micromanagement way, where you say, hey buddy, you did 10 story points last time, but this week you only did 5 story points, so you're going to have to work overtime to get in those extra points. That's the way that's the way many Scrum organizations will work, and it's just a system for punishment, and it gets developers to quit and find other jobs that haven't gone this route yet. So the other way, the beneficial way that I finally, after years of this, came to terms with, is that you're learning your estimation. You say, oh, I thought that task was a 5-point medium difficulty task. That task was harder than I thought. That's the most important part. So that next time you see a similar task, you can say, why did it take me twice as long as I thought to do that task? And you say, oh, because I forgot, or I didn't take into account that setting up the development server was going to take a long time. I didn't anticipate having problems doing that. So then the next time you say, oh, you know what? This really isn't even 1 medium task, it's 2 medium difficulty tasks, because setting up the environment took a lot longer than I thought. And then you might have to make another task to automate that whole process so you don't have to do it again, but that's for another time. The main benefit of story points is so that as developers you can learn to estimate projects better over time. The amount of work you get done in a week should be pretty consistent. So with all the negative things that I have to say about Scrum and Agile, there are definite benefits. The processes get a lot more consistent, which is good. Your delivery becomes a lot more consistent of code, which is good. You have smaller pieces of code, which is sometimes good, sometimes it's a little bit annoying, but you're making sure that everything works, and using story points to become better at estimating and also better at breaking down the tasks into correctly sized units of work. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you like what you heard, click like and subscribe below. And also, please visit us at seniorwebdeveloper.life And our goal is to help you transition from being somebody who just started, maybe somebody who's been through a code boot camp or just graduated from college, and maybe has your first job or your second job, and get you ready for the third and fourth jobs to move you kind of up the ladder. Have a great day.